Putin is also not a young man anymore, and we may see new Russian leadership who may be like actually more inclined to do this sort of thing than Putin is. Article 5 is not just sort of like a one-player game. It's like, in theory, Article 5 is triggered. NATO has 3 nuclear powers, not 1. And so in theory, what's supposed to happen is that NATO is supposed to come together and agree collectively. The things that depended on is that they expect to have just this enormous body of reserve forces, right? And it's like, yeah, we sort of sent a bunch of guys driving through this radioactive crater, but that's okay because we've got more.
Hello everyone, my name is Eugeniusz Romer. I work for Układ Sił, a foreign policy magazine from Poland, and today I have a great pleasure to interview Edward Geist from RAND Corporation. Hello, sir.
Hello.
And we are going to discuss nuclear strategies of many countries of the world, starting from Russia. So Vladimir Putin has recently announced that he's going to change the nuclear doctrine of Russian Federation, like significantly lowering the threshold of using the nuclear weapons. So why, in your opinion, he did this?
So presumably to increase the credibility of threats of limited nuclear use. So the Russians over the past several years have been engaged in regularly, either implicitly or explicitly, stating that if certain things that they cast as provocations are done by the United States and its allies in support of Ukraine, that they will potentially employ nuclear weapons in some form or fashion. The problem with this is that it's like increasingly, as time goes on and they don't make good on any of these threats, it increasingly sounds like cheap talk. So this is a way to try and make that sort of rhetoric more politically effective again. I mean, the big question that everyone is talking about right now is like, well, is this just like, does it actually mean anything?
Is it credible?
Right,
yeah.
Because there's a difference between what's called declaratory policy and sort of like actual operational use policy. So you can say that you're going to do one thing, actually have no intention or readiness to actually do it. As time unfolds, right, so the Russians have announced that they're making this change in policy. If we start observing things, like they actually start like operating their forces differently, that will mean that it's more credible than if they just said this and then nothing observable actually changes. That doesn't mean that they didn't necessarily change something that might be important, but we don't actually have firm indicators of that.
So what does the past say about the Russian threats of using the nuclear weapons? For example, the US or allied countries, they delivered, for example, F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, or the Ukrainians invaded Russian territory and still the Russians didn't use the tactical weapons. So what do you think? This is, does it say anything about the future?
So one of the key important considerations, I think, is that it's not like there's some like clever use of the Russians' extensive arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons, as they're called, that would materially change the military situation there in a way that like would solve their military problems. So like it turns out that obviously it's like non-strategic nuclear weapons are like, they're not good for actually like holding territory. It's like nuclear weapons are extraordinarily effective at destroying relatively sort of like dense point targets. And if we're willing to use large yield nuclear weapons that we normally think of as strategic, like sure, you can devastate an enormous area if you're willing to use high yield nuclear weapons. So-called tactical nuclear weapons, usually these things are of lower yields, and when you start actually mapping out on a battlefield, it's like, oh, well, like to what radius is this going to kill like tanks and so forth? It's like, it turns out that even though like a remote use of nuclear weapons in a remote area might still cause a lot of sort of like collateral impacts that you might really care about, it isn't necessarily such a great way to sort of solve the military problem of, it's like, oh, we want to punch a hole in the front and then we're going to exploit that opening that we created. It's very difficult to square the circle between it's lethal enough that it killed all of your opponents and so that they can't recover it, but it's also still passable enough that you can do it. One of the differences between the Soviet concepts, because back in the battle days in the Cold War, there was the Soviet doctrine that was like, oh, we're going to use all these tactical nuclear weapons, and literally the doctrine is like, we're going to try and blow a hole in the NATO front lines in Germany, and then we are going to like drive through and exploit that. one of the ways that things that depended on is that they expected to have just this enormous body of reserve forces, right? And it's like, yeah, we sort of sent a bunch of guys driving through this radioactive crater, but that's okay because we've got more. A lot of the problems that the Russians are having in Ukraine right now is even though they've like had this whole mobilization campaign, they just don't have the kind of numerical superiority that they need in order to exploit this. And it's like the tactical nuclear weapons actually don't solve that problem in the way that they would need to. It's like the Russians can threaten to destroy things. It's like if they did use them, it might be as a signal to like, oh, you need to worry about things getting a lot worse. It's like we nuke something, now you know that we're willing to quote unquote use nuclear weapons. Like you should be worried about a whole lot of them being used at once. But that's different from the idea that like, oh, well, like we nuke one or two things and then suddenly like our opponents basically like can't resist us anymore. This just isn't that kind of conflict, frankly.
So nuclear weapons for current Russian administration, let's say, they are not the means of achieving some military goals. Rather, they are rather, I don't know, weapons or tools that have some psychological effects of deterrence, actually.
Well, it's both. So there's if you read like what Russian sort of like military thinkers think about this, it's not that there aren't military problems that they don't think limited nuclear use can solve. It's that the specific military problems that they're facing in Ukraine are not among those sorts of problems. So when the Russians talk about using limited nuclear employment in a conflict against NATO, I would be inclined to take that very seriously. But with this sort of like proxy war that they're fighting, it doesn't really solve their problems. Like there's not a way to use nuclear weapons against the Ukrainians that like actually sort of like gets them closer to their strategic goals. If their objective is to create problems for the US or NATO in like an actual direct shooting war between them, then it becomes a lot more logical, not least of which is that the Russians have very little with enough reach to get at NATO that is sort of like liable to be effective in a non-nuclear role. So one of the things that happened in Ukraine is that they've expended so many of their conventional munitions, right, that they're doing all sorts of crazy things. Like now they're buying these munitions from the North Koreans and the Iranians because they are running short of their own. But in the opening phase of the war, like they're just burning through their conventional munition stockpile. And those conventional munitions turned out to be a lot less effective than they were hoping they were going to be. And so like the logical implication of this is that the Russians would think that in a all-out shooting war between Russia and NATO that, well, they may need to go nuclear early because it's like the conventional munitions just couldn't get the job done, right?
So this is a sign of weakness, actually, that the Russians are changing the doctrine.
Yeah, well, like a heavy reliance on non-strategic nuclear weapons has historically, it's been essentially an admission, at least, of conventional weakness. So when the United States has what was today is dubbed the first offset. That's kind of a retcon that Bob Work popularized 10 years ago. But there's like the first offset, which is the introduction of tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons to the U.S. arsenal to try and cancel out Soviet and Warsaw Pact conventional numerical superiority. So the idea was that, look, it's like the Soviets, man for man, they may be worse than ours, maybe by a lot. There are so many of them that we expect to be sent at us that there's no way we are willing to like support like a conventional military that'll be able to resist them, even on the assumption that we'll have a defender's advantage at the conventional level. So what we're going to do is we're going to have like a relatively, compared to the Soviets, like by present day standards, it's actually still a very substantial conventional force numerically, but that they would equip them with all these nuclear weapons. And so what the Soviets have to worry about is they roll into West Germany and then like they run into American troops. And there were these, in hindsight, they seem completely crazy, but the theory, if the theory was to just give the Soviets serious pause, is like that actually made sense. We're just like, yeah, it's like we've invented tactical nuclear weapons that are given to frontline units. So the most infamous example of this thing is the so-called Davy Crockett, an unguided nuclear armed rocket that could be launched, for instance, off of a Jeep or by a couple of infantrymen, and it had like a nuclear warhead that was about the size of a watermelon, like lowest yield nuclear weapon that has ever been stockpiled. And the theory there, though, is that, look, it's like we're going to like stud like, you know, West Germany is just going to be filled with this stuff, and like the Red Army starts rolling into it, and they're just going to encounter like Americans with nuclear weapons, and maybe not a whole lot to lose otherwise if you're in that situation. So there were arguments at the time that it was quite controversial in the 1960s, but like there was this argument that like, oh, well, maybe what we want in West Germany for these tactical nuclear weapons is kind of like a fuse in like the thermonuclear powder keg. It's like the idea is that these are irrevocable tokens of American commitment that in sort of, for instance, like some European thinkers, the assumption was that, look, it's like the Americans, if this looks like it's going down, may decide it's like, yeah, we're just pulling out of Europe. We're not making good on our promises because we're not trading Boston for Berlin. It's like if you already got your troops in there, and as soon as things start going hot, is like you're going to have Soviet forces encountering nuclear-armed American forces. This couples the American homeland to the fate of Central Europe, which is what they wanted. The idea in this case was not necessarily, although there were also people who argued like, oh, you can win a tactical nuclear war. It's like this was, by like the 1970s, there weren't a whole lot of people around who still made that kind of argument. We kept the tactical nuclear weapons there because they served both a political and a strategic role. Like the idea is not like, oh, well, this really quote unquote solves our military problems. It solves our political and strategic problems.
So you mentioned the situation in the early Cold War, that the Europeans are or were afraid that the Americans are not going to trade, let's say, Los Angeles for Paris, right, or
yeah.
the other European city. So if the logic was, if the Russians were to attack with a strategic warhead, let's say Paris, the Americans would respond, and then the Russians would destroy America. And it didn't sound credible for the Europeans. So Charles de Gaulle,
yeah.
the French president, he started a French nuclear program to acquire
yes.
nuclear weapons. So do you think the current situation resembles some kind of this situation that we had back then in the Cold War? Because now Russians are threatening that they are going to nuke a country that is helping, for example, Ukraine, which is attacking Russia.
Yeah.
So it doesn't only mean the US, it would mean, for example, the France or the UK, which are also delivering weapons to Ukraine. So do you think do you see some resemblance?
Well, there are points of confluence, but there are also some very significant differences. So part of it is that, like, you have this early Cold War context. Like I believe de Gaulle made that comment on what, like 1962, maybe. And so at that time, we had the situation where like the basic assumption was that, oh, well, like the communist side has this enormous conventional superiority, and there's no practicable way to cancel out the conventional superiority, and that therefore, like, the flip side of that is that, like, okay, well, like, there's not really like a great way to avoid this conflict going nuclear, and therefore either the U.S. will have a choice of like risking our homeland or just like letting it happen. Now, one of the important pieces of context here in this early moment is that, so the French declare that they are going to develop their own independent nuclear arsenal. Britain already has one, but Britain has, as of the late 1950s, now has this very tightly coupled relationship with the U.S., where the British at that time, and still do, have this notion that they want a purely national nuclear deterrent, in the sense that they want to have the option of being able to use nuclear weapons without American help. But otherwise, it's like they're very, very tightly integrated with the American way of doing things. So it's like we share the same kind of submarine-launched missiles and things like that. The French have always preferred to go it like completely alone. So it's like they develop their own weapons, they design their own missiles and submarines and bombers. They want to make sure that it's sort of like not dependent on anyone for this capability. In the early 1960s, it was a huge concern of both the Americans and the Soviets that the West Germans were going to basically follow that same logic and develop their own arsenal. And so on the, you know, like the Soviets are still thinking of like, we just fought these people less than 20 years ago. It's like, we can't have them have nuclear weapons. Like, there's concern like the West Germans really went there that it would basically like cause World War III. And on the US side, there was the similar sort of concern, and there were all these creative ideas about how do we convince the Germans not to build their own nuclear arsenal. In hindsight, the extent to which the West German government was ever really serious about this is unclear. So there's a pretty convincing argument that the senior-most level of the West German leadership wasn't really planning on doing it, but they were very heavily invested in convincing the Americans especially that they might, because this is the way that they're extracting all kinds of other kinds of concessions. So there were various ideas. There was like an idea that really was invented by American diplomats but seemed to have legs for a while, called the multilateral force. The idea there was that there will be multinational craft with multinational crews that will have basically American nuclear weapons, but you would have, in some sense, you would be delegating part of what today we would think of as like strategic nuclear deterrence to this multinational force. And it was thought that this is better than, because at the time there was a prospect, not just the West Germans, but like the Italians or like various West European countries are thinking about this, to have a multilateral force where we would have, for instance, like, oh, we have an Italian ship with a multinational crew that has missile tubes in it with American missiles, with American nuclear warheads, and that this would be better than an environment where a bunch of additional NATO countries would have their own arsenals. This ended up fizzling out for various reasons. Like we ended up having the nuclear sharing program instead, which still exists. And so today, what we ended up with instead of something like the multilateral force is that we have these what are called dual capable aircraft. And then we have American weapons that are then stored in various allied countries with the understanding that under the appropriate circumstances, these weapons would be released to the host country to do with as they saw fit. Yes, should I?
Yeah, so my question is, what would be a reaction by the US if the Russians hit, for example, a country in the eastern flank of NATO with a tactical or strategic nuclear warhead in case of any conflict? So do you think that the Americans would give a response in such a way, a similar response?
Well, I think that it is worth considering that, okay, so that happens, that is like absolutely, like that's what Article 5 is supposed to trigger. That is what Article 5 is for, right? Mm-hmm. And NATO, it's like, sure, like America is sort of like the foremost country in the NATO alliance, but like Article 5 is not just sort of like a one-player game. It's like, in theory, Article 5 is triggered. NATO has 3 nuclear powers, not 1. And so in theory, what's supposed to happen is that NATO is supposed to come together and agree collectively. It's not just supposed to be the US president sitting down and just like, I'm going to decide what's going to happen. Like, obviously, the US president is going to play a big role in this, but it's not like the US gets to unilaterally dictate, like, what are we going to do about this? It is going to be...
But if the US is against, I think the others also would do the same.
I think that may be maybe not giving the French enough credit. At least if Macron is serious about his rhetoric, and maybe he is. After all, it's like for the Europeans, it's much, much closer to home. And in theory, like what the way the alliance is supposed to work is that but like if for whatever reason the U.S. can't or won't contribute, like the others are supposed to step up. And it would be inimical to U.S. security strategy and what has been in practice our bipartisan consensus over the course of many decades to just sort of like not do anything about this. Now, it would really depend I think it would depend what the response would be on exactly what had happened. So there's a huge difference between, like, let's say that the Russians tried to do something and we managed to shoot it down. And like we know for various reasons that it was real, but we thwarted it. Like at that point is like our nuking them in response probably would be an overreaction. On the other hand, if they just decided to like nuke a NATO capital out of nowhere, which is like very much an extreme sort of thing that I wouldn't expect the Russians to do, right, despite various misdeeds that they have committed in recent years. That would elicit a very, very different response, right? So it's pretty obvious that it's like, once again, it depends. If you're referring to, like, there's Eastern NATO flank, which would presumably, fairly or not, because that's the thing about Article 5. Article 5 is supposed to apply equally to all NATO members. It's not like it matters more which one it is in practice. The politics depend somewhat on which one it is. Yes, so I do think that the details really matter, and it's hard to know in advance, and it would depend a lot on the personalities involved. not just like, there's the obvious question of like, what does the US president want to do, but also the other personalities like Macron and also like, I suppose we're probably assuming implicitly that it's Putin doing this here, but it's like Putin is also not a young man anymore, and we may see new Russian leadership who may be like actually more inclined to do this sort of thing than Putin is.
And we also have the Chinese, who are also very important in terms of nuclear strategy of many countries. So many analysts, they believe that Xi Jinping is the one who is stopping Putin from using the nukes. But on the other hand, when Putin was announcing his new doctrine, nuclear doctrine, at the same time, about the same time, the Chinese were testing their intercontinental missile capabilities. So some analysts, they believe this is a sign that the Chinese are also somehow allowing Russians to use nukes. So what's your opinion on this?
So there is this widespread impression, which I think is credible, that the Xi and the other sort of like members of the Chinese ruling elite, they very much do not want the Russians to go and use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Like, some of them are concerns that the US and any sort of like sensible government shares. Like, so we have this thing that is Nina Tannenwald dubbed the nuclear taboo. It's like since 1945, nuclear weapons have not been used in combat. And this has led to a situation where it is generally sort of considered illegitimate in some sense to actually use nuclear weapons, as opposed to have them and to say that you're going to use them if they are used against you, or like subjected to some similarly existential threat, that then it's okay, but like otherwise, like you're not actually supposed to use them, like for instance, just because you are losing a war of conquest that you started. It is better off probably for everyone to not change that. So it's not better for the Chinese, who are aspiring to a future in which they have, like the kind of conventional power that they would need. It's like they would have much more usable sorts of capabilities. The kind of after effects, like accepting even like, is just like ignoring this question of like, oh, we don't want to live in a world without the nuclear taboo and all like the uncertainty that would come with it. There's also the consideration that it's like, yeah, it's like if there's like a limited nuclear war in Europe, like this is probably going to cause like an enormous global economic contraction that would also affect the Chinese really badly. They have all sorts of reasons to not want the Russians to use nuclear weapons that are purely self-interested. Now, as for the modernization of the Chinese strategic nuclear forces, these are things that the Chinese would be doing anyway. It's like those are things that the Chinese would be doing just as much, or maybe harder, if, for instance, like recent history in Russia had gone very different, and like, like Navalny was president of Russia now, and like Russia was moving to be like Western orbit. You would still expect the Chinese to be, sort of like modernizing their nuclear force. Yes.
So why the Chinese are doing this? They announced they are going to build at least, I don't know, maybe it wasn't an announcement, but this is a belief of American intelligence that they're going to build 1,500 nuclear warheads until 2035. So what's the purpose, and how does that change the equation? Because so far we had two major players, and the mutual assured destruction was really assured. And now when we have like three countries capable of destroying the whole world, how does this change the situation?
Well, so this is, I would separate that into two questions. There's the question of why are the Chinese doing it, and how is this different from sort of like a more bipolar sort of environment that we were used to during the Cold War. So the first question is a very good question, and the answer is that, frankly, we're not sure, because the Chinese aren't talking about this. Like, the Chinese are not formally acknowledging that they're doing this, even though it's now, thanks to open source intelligence, like you can see the missile silos that they're building, the U.S. Government has announced that the estimate is that they are expanding their nuclear arsenal at a rate that we would expect. If you just draw the line out on the chart, you end up at about the number that you quoted. That is like middle of the next decade, you expect them to have about 1,500 warheads total. Now, that's keep in mind that the 1,500 is the arms control treaty counting rule size of the U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals. It's actually fewer weapons than the U.S. and Russia currently have. But this would take the Chinese from having like about a tenth of the size of the arsenal of the U.S. or Russia to having about the same. Like it would be sort of like similar enough that it's not that meaningful a difference. So there were various theories about why the Chinese are doing this, and because they aren't talking, it's hard to determine which ones might be dominant. It's also possible that this question doesn't have a straightforward answer. So let's imagine, for instance, it's like we kidnap Xi Jinping, we shoot him up with sodium pentothal, and we ask him, like, why are you expanding the size of your nuclear arsenal? And depending on what day we did that, he might give a different answer, right? It's often these matters, it's clear that Xi and the other people sort of like in his immediate milieu decided that they wanted to do this. We know that for sure. We don't know what they were thinking. We don't know whether they had a consistent rationale for it. There are various plausible ones that have been put forward from that. The Chinese want to, for purely prestige reasons, that they want to do this in order to be in the same tier in every sort of like area of military domain as the US and Russia are. There's also the notion that it's supposed to like solve specific strategic problems. There's the argument that they are concerned enough about future U.S. missile defenses that they feel like they need to have a larger arsenal just to make sure that they would still have some sort of like assured retaliation capability against the U.S. There's probably elements of all of those in play, and sorting out, that's a question ultimately for the historians if they ever get access to the relevant materials. So we're not sure, but it's also not clear that it actually matters why they decided to do it or why they think they're doing it now. Like what matters is the strategic environment that we'll be living in and what sort of problems or opportunities that creates.
But that definitely would require the US to, let's say, modernize and maybe enlarge its own arsenal. So what do you think is going to be the approach of either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump to this area or field of national defense?
So one of the interesting features of this area of policy in the U.S. in recent years is that if you get past sort of like the surface level bumper sticker rhetoric, the actual policy of both Democratic and Republican administrations has been very consistent, to the point where it's like there are people who started calling this like the bipartisan consensus. The way that this emerged was as basically like a trade between the Obama administration promised to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal in exchange for getting ratification of the New START treaty in 2011. So what has happened since then is that the New START treaty by design is like it only allowed for one 5-year extension when its original 10-year term ran out. And so in February 2026, it's like it's going to expire. And like the language in the treaty does not allow it to be extended past there. It's like the New START treaty is going away, and the prospect of anything like it being negotiated anytime soon is now evaporated, especially in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what has emerged since then is that there is, despite some doubters in Congress about various specific parts of the nuclear force modernization program, the current understanding is that we're definitely doing something like the current force modernization program is the policy. So like the Biden administration has only rescinded really like one notable component of what the Trump administration policy had been in terms of like what we were going to make. So it's like the nuclear submarine launched cruise missile, the so-called SLICM-N. That was something that the Trump administration wanted. The Biden administration tried to cancel it as like the Congress supported it. So that is going forward. Now there's this discussion because the Chinese are building up. It's like, well, does the U.S. need more weapons? I think that it's important to keep in mind here is that nuclear weapons don't magically cancel out other nuclear weapons. Like people sort of think that way in this Cold War mindset back when that was more true than it is now. But you have to analyze these things in terms of like the real sort of like structure of the adversary nuclear force. So for instance, like there are missiles with more than one warhead on them. The Russians actually have a lot of those things. It only takes not just one nuclear warhead to take something like that out, but you can conceive of potential future weapons that might be able to target those things without using nuclear warheads at all. So there was one of my predecessors that ran, a guy named Carl Bilder, who thought about this extensively in the 1980s, about so-called conventional counterforce weapons. Now, in the 1980s, that sort of thing was like purely aspirational, but today, given some of the things that we've seen in recent and ongoing conflicts, like the idea that you could build something that could potentially do that, this is an area where artificial intelligence comes in. It's like the idea of, oh, we want to build a thing that'll be able to recognize what the target is, and it's like, yeah, it has a vulnerable spot that you put like a shaped charge on, and it's maybe like this big or something like that. Like back in the 80s, that was just like, ah, well, wouldn't that be a nice sort of like sci-fi fantasy? Today, it's like, yeah, you just order the parts, you know, on the open market, and you assemble this thing, and you use the freely available open source software to train it. Like the idea of building weapons that, until very recently, weren't really practical is open to more and more players. Now, what does that mean for strategic stability? Well, you know, you have to read my book. That's the.
But I read the recent book by Henry Kissinger, and he wrote also about this issue. Let's say how AI may, let's say, facilitate global conflicts. So he said that the situation that we have now with the AI based weapons, it resembles the situation that we had before the First World War. So back then, the country that was able to quicker mobilize its own military was more likely to win, right? So that's why all Europe and whole world actually at the end, let's say, militarized itself very quickly. So nowadays we have this situation because, as you said, AI can, let's say, identify something as a weapon, which is really not, but that it may cause a response and a global response, right? So do you agree with this logic?
So I think that what we're likely to see once you take into account the full action-reaction cycle is that, sure, AI may create new opportunities, but it also creates new problems, which from the standpoint of whether you're the attacker or the defender, it's not clear whether it favors like the attacker the way that it's sort of like what Kissinger's narrative is sort of intuiting, right? Like the idea that, oh, well, AI favors the attacker because you'll be able to sort of make these splendid attacks and like win very quickly. It's like, okay, well, let's just say that like somebody was really trying to do this. It's like, how would you cancel it out? It's like, well, what opportunities do new technology offer for trying to neutralize that kind of tactic? And so a lot of the argument of my recent book is about this, it's like, oh, well, like, especially it's becoming more intuitive to people because in the generative AI moment, like people are messing around with generative AI constantly, and it's becoming increasingly apparent. It's like, oh, you can, like, computers can now sort of like generate fake pictures of whatever you want, but they can also like create fake audio, and like it's starting to be like fake films. And the way just over the last couple of years this has been going forward, it's like, oh, well, like the idea that AI might be better for enhancing deception than for seeing through it is starting to become something that people intuit because like this is what they're living, right? It's like, oh, well, like how am I going to tell which of my students like just had ChatGPT write their essays? Like, yeah, it turns out that OpenAI gave up on making a tool to do that because it seems to be somewhere between extraordinarily difficult and literally impossible, right? So if we're in an environment where technology is favoring deceivers over those that are trying to see through their deceptions, what sort of opportunities does that present for instance, like, oh, I need to obfuscate my military forces so nobody can do the sort of thing that you were imagining. It's like make it so that it's like my adversary who might attack me, it's like I don't know where their stuff is exactly. It's like I have a reasonable guess, but like there's all this weird sort of like AI augmented sort of nonsense, and not just like signals nonsense, not just like, oh, I'm posting things on social media, but it's like, yeah, we made some drones and the drones have got these little transponders on them and they're generating like fake sort of like electromagnetic signatures and things like that. And also a lot of like really old-timey sort of stuff, just like your inflatable tanks and things. You can use an area of AI that's not ML called automated planning to sort of like orchestrate all this. And so you can do all of this together at once, and what I call it in my book is a fog of war machine. It's like you harness the technology in order to create knowledge quality problems for your adversary. Now, what does that mean for strategic stability? It's complicated because on the one hand, while it seems like it should neutralize a lot of these concerns about like, oh, well, like whoever goes the furthest, like, has this huge advantage. It also has the problem, if you look at it from a different time scale, it's just this like, okay, like, how is anybody supposed to trust each other in a world like this, where everybody makes sort of like systematic deceit maybe the foundation of their approach to national security, right? It seems like in a lot of ways that's a worse world to be in than one where everybody sort of, like the Cold War world, where both sides, because of spy satellites, it's like they actually know a lot about what each other are doing. And like that helped build trust, because it's like, well, they've got enough to kill all of us and we've got enough to kill all of them, but they can't win and we can't win by going first. The spy satellites gave each side knew enough to be afraid, but not enough to have like a chance at winning. And that was this great sort of stabilizing thing, but it emerged by accident. There's no guarantee that the future is going to look anything like that.
All right. My last question is, I know we are a bit tight with the time, but I really need to ask this question about Poland. Do you think countries like Poland should develop their own nuclear programs just to become more secure in the neighborhood of countries like Russia? Or maybe Poland should try to be the part of nuclear sharing program of NATO?
So I cannot in good faith endorse nuclear proliferation as the solution to your national security problems.
Is it American perspective, or do you think objectively it wouldn't be good for Poland?
So there are a lot of costs associated with it. Like, it's worth it looking at all the countries that have either, there's only one country that has done it and then undone it, which is South Africa. But there are a lot of countries that have thought seriously about it, and some of them have gotten pretty close. And one of the reasons why, after all this time, there have only been 10 nuclear powers in total, and there are currently 9 because the South Africans gave up their weapons, is because these things are in many ways, a lot of countries have looked at this and realized this is more trouble than it's worth. One of the reasons for that is because the US and Russia, and maybe sometime in the future China, like, they're sort of like the top tier, and they're sort of like lower tiers, but like aspiring to the top tier is something that very few countries can or want to do. It is true that like they don't literally cancel each other out. Having a few nuclear weapons like does in some ways really matter. But once you get into this, and also another important characteristic is that if you want to have sort of like the sort of, not just assured destruction capability, maybe going a little too far, but it's like I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of this, but what the French used to call a force de frappe, like the idea of a force it's not enough to like impose like assured destruction on the Soviet Union, but it's enough to like take out Moscow, and they assume that that's going to make
Russia.
Yes. So even that's a lot of resources. It's like, it turns out that the weapons themselves are comparatively cheap compared to like the delivery systems and like the operating those delivery systems. It's a very non-trivial sort of thing if you want to do it seriously. And the number of countries that have done it in sort of like a very peripheral sort of like, yeah, we want this capability, but we don't want to pay the freight on doing it like the proper way. So we're just going to have like a few, and they're going to be sort of like of token value. I think it's telling that, in fact, that was the South African position, is that the South Africans sort of had like, is a very rudimentary, just a handful of weapons of a very primitive kind that were going to be delivered on like their existing aircraft. That ended up not being worth it. And you compare it to like North Korea, which by...
Yes. So I will stop you here and ask about Ukraine, because Ukraine decided to give its nuclear weapons to Russia. Mm-hmm. And the question is asked by many people in Poland as well: would it have been invaded if it had nuclear weapons?
So it would have. The alternate timeline where the Ukrainians managed to keep them would be considerably different, in the sense that it is likely that, like, an important consideration is that the weapons that were in Ukraine at the time the Soviet Union collapsed is like there had been a process over the period of several years to reconsolidate all non-strategic Soviet nuclear weapons into Russia proper, in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of breakaway republics and so forth. And they claim to have not lost any. There's no public evidence that they lost any, and my impression is that they didn't lose any, that they really did remain under Russian control. What was in Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan were Soviet strategic nuclear missiles that happen to be located there, so like in silos. And these things had nuclear warheads on them, but the use controls on them were controlled by an entity that had been Soviet and now had fallen under control of the Russian national government. So what happened was that the Ukrainians physically had possession of nuclear weapons, but they were not in a position to maintain or use those nuclear weapons, which meant that the nuclear weapons were not actually useful for the purpose of, say, deterring the Russians if the Russians tried to attack them in the 1990s to get the nuclear weapons back. Under the circumstances where the Ukrainians started saying, like, we're just keeping these things, my impression is that, given that this is back in the era when, you know, like, Yeltsin and Clinton are, like, wonderful friends, that the Russians would just be as like, yeah, it's like we're invading Ukraine to get the nuclear weapons out, and the U.S. would have been as like, great. It's like, how can we help? It's like the parallel universe is not one in which, like, Kuchma says, like, we're just going to be a nuclear power now, and the rest of the world accepts that. It's like Ukraine, like, if it had somehow managed to dodge this, would have ended up being probably a pariah state, given what international conditions were in the 1990s, or perhaps more likely it would have ended up being invaded with, I mean, it could even have been not the Russians doing this. It's like the idea of permitting the international agreement at the time was like Russia is the inheritor of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal and no one else gets to have any, and the U.S. has agreed to this. The Ukrainians are, frankly, which was wise for them at the time, it's like Kuchma is trying to string the U.S. along to, or stringing everyone along to try and extract as much as possible in exchange for giving the weapons up. But the ability to maintain a viable nuclear arsenal over time, well, it's not strictly speaking impossible, but it would have required certain conditions to be met. Basically, there would have had to have been at least probably a few Ukrainian sympathizers, of which there very well may have been some, inside of the Russian nuclear weapons complex to help them get some of the things that they needed. For instance, it's like, yeah, we need to figure out how to get this warhead and sort of like remove like the kill switch that the Russians have inside of it and sort of like install our replacement for that. Yeah, so like it wasn't really a viable alternative. So even though it's like the tragedy of the lesson seems sort of clear-cut, it's not so clear-cut when you consider what was really possible for the Ukrainians 30 years ago.
So I'm really impressed with your broad knowledge about nuclear strategy and everything related. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Very insightful.
I'm flattered to hear you say that.
Thank you very much. And many thanks to our viewers. Thank you and goodbye.